They laughed at the mountain man's fat bride until she removed her veil at the ceremony. The church bell tolled, the crowd snickered, and the groom stood tall, refusing to flinch. They mocked her as she walked the dusty aisle, her veil hiding the truth. But when it lifted, every cruel word froze in the air. This wasn't just a wedding. This was the start of a battle. Behind that veil was a woman with a secret more powerful than rifles or gold. A deed to land the railroad would kill to own, and a faith strong enough to face every prejudice in the valley. The laughter would soon turn to fury. The deputy wanted her silenced. The ranchers wanted her gone. And the mountain man, he would have to choose between vengeance with his gun or justice with her courage. What happens when a town's cruelty collides with a love strong enough to change it? And can one unveiled bride turn ridicule into redemption before everything they've built burns to the ground? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Calico Springs' dusty main street as Boone Callahan guided his horse toward the heart of town. The steady clip-clop of hooves mingled with the distant whistle of an approaching train. Beside him, a small wagon creaked along, its canvas cover rippling in the warm breeze. Under that protective shade sat Lydia May, his bride-to-be, her face obscured by a delicate veil that matched her cream-colored dress. Boone's weathered face remained stoic as he noted the townspeople's reactions. Shop owners paused in their doorways, and women gathering at the general store's porch lowered their voices to whispers. He had expected this. Small railroad towns like Calico Springs thrived on gossip as much as commerce. The wagon wheel caught a rut, making Lydia sway slightly. Boone immediately reined his horse closer, protective instinct kicking in. "Almost there," he said softly, his voice carrying just far enough for her to hear. Through the veil, he caught the slight nod of her head. As they approached the whitewashed clapboard church, the whispers grew more distinct. Two women in fine silk dresses barely bothered to hide their commentary behind their fans. "Lord above, did you see the size of her?" one hissed to her companion. "Poor Boone Callahan must have been desperate indeed." "Or blind," came the cruel reply, followed by poorly concealed laughter. Boone's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward. Years of tracking game in the Rockies had taught him patience. Those same skills now helped him ignore the stabbing glances and muffled snickers that followed their progress down the street. The church stood modest but proud against the backdrop of distant mountains. Its fresh paint gleamed in the sunlight, and purple wildflowers bordered the short path to its doors. Reverend Matthews waited on the steps, his kind face a welcome sight amid the sea of judgment. Boone dismounted first, his boots raising small puffs of dust as they hit the ground. Without hesitation, he strode to the wagon's side. Lydia's hand, when it met his, was steady and warm. He helped her down with gentle care, conscious of her full figure, but more aware of her innate grace. The way she moved reminded him of summer wind through mountain meadows, natural and beautiful. "Welcome, welcome," Reverend Matthews called out, drowning the latest wave of whispers with his booming voice. "Brother Boone, Sister Lydia, you honor us with your presence today." More townsfolk were gathering now, filing into the church with a mixture of genuine interest and barely concealed disdain. The wooden steps creaked under their weight, and the sound of rustling skirts filled the air. Through it all, Lydia kept her head high, though Boone noticed how her fingers tightened slightly on his arm. Inside, the church was cool and dim, with afternoon light filtering through simple glass windows. Wooden pews stretched in two neat rows, their oak surfaces worn smooth by years of faithful attendance. The air smelled of beeswax candles and fresh-cut flowers. Boone recognized the purple blooms from the churchyard, now arranged in simple clay pots near the altar. As they moved down the center aisle, the whispers continued. A child's voice, clear and innocent, cut through the murmurs. "Mama, why's the lady so big?" "Hush now," came the mother's sharp reply, but the damage was done. Laughter rippled through the congregation like wind through dry grass. Boone's free hand clenched into a fist. He had faced down grizzlies and survived winter storms that would freeze a man's blood, but this casual cruelty tested his patience more than any natural threat. Yet the gentle pressure of Lydia's hand on his arm reminded him of why they were here. This wasn't about the townsfolk or their narrow minds. This was about making a promise before God. Reverend Matthews arranged the wedding party at the front of the church. The afternoon light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, creating a kind of halo effect around Lydia's veiled form. Despite the continued creaking of pews and the occasional poorly suppressed giggle, she stood straight and dignified. Boone took his place beside her, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of judgment pressing in from all sides. Through the veil, he could just make out the curve of Lydia's cheek, the proud set of her chin. He remembered the first time he'd heard her singing Cherokee hymns at her father's mission, how her voice had stopped him in his tracks, how her kindness had slowly worked its way past his defenses, like spring thaw breaking winter's grip. The congregation settled, though tension still hung thick in the air. Sunlight slanted through the windows, catching the simple gold band Boone held ready. He had traded 3 prime beaver pelts for that ring, and he reckoned it was worth every one. The pews creaked again as people shifted, their judgment a tangible presence in the small church. But Boone's attention remained fixed on Lydia. Through the veil, through the whispers and stares, she remained as steady as the mountains themselves. Her presence beside him felt right in a way that defied explanation, like finding shelter during a storm or water in the desert. He had made his choice, and no amount of small-town scorn could shake his certainty. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat, preparing to begin the ceremony. The late afternoon light painted everything in amber tones, and for a moment the church fell silent. In that brief peace, Boone could almost imagine they were alone. Just him, Lydia, and the promise they were about to make. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and somewhere in the back of the church, someone failed to completely smother a laugh. But Boone stood firm, his scarred hands steady as he waited for the ceremony to begin. He had chosen Lydia, and she had chosen him. What the good people of Calico Springs thought about that choice meant about as much to him as last year's snow. The Reverend opened his Bible, its pages rustling in the hushed church. The wedding procession had formed, ready to witness this union, even if some were present more for the spectacle than the celebration. Through it all, Lydia's veiled form remained steady beside Boone, her quiet dignity a rebuke to every whispered judgment. Reverend Matthews raised his well-worn Bible, and the afternoon light streaming through the windows gave way to the warm glow of freshly lit oil lamps. Their flames danced against the whitewashed walls, casting gentle shadows that seemed to soften the hard edges of judgment in the small church. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice steady and clear, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Boone stood tall beside Lydia, his calloused hand gentle as it held hers. Through years of mountain winters and lonely trails, he'd never imagined finding such peace in another soul's presence. Now, with lamplight flickering across the wooden floors and sacred words filling the air, that presence steadied him like a compass pointing true north. "Marriage," Reverend Matthews continued, "is an honorable estate instituted of God in the time of man's innocence." His words carried weight in the hushed church, though somewhere in the back, a pew creaked with restless movement. Lydia's hand trembled slightly in Boone's grasp, but her chin remained lifted, dignity flowing from her like a quiet stream. Even veiled, her presence commanded a grace that seemed to fill the humble space with something greater than mere ceremony. "Boone Callahan," the Reverend spoke, turning to face him, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do." Boone's voice carried clear and strong, like mountain air after rain. "And do you, Lydia May, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do." Lydia's voice, though soft, held such sweetness that even the most hardened whispers in the congregation fell silent for a moment. The time came for the exchange of rings. Boone's hands, steady enough to track game through blinding snow, now moved with deliberate care as he slipped the simple gold band onto Lydia's finger. The metal caught the lamplight, gleaming like a promise made solid. "And now," Reverend Matthews announced, "you may kiss your bride." Boone turned to face Lydia fully, his movements measured and reverent. The church grew still as he reached for her veil, all eyes fixed on this moment they'd gathered to mock. With gentle hands that had built cabins and broken wild horses, he lifted the delicate fabric. A collective gasp filled the church as Lydia's face was revealed. The lamplight caught her features, showing not the object of ridicule they'd expected, but a woman of striking beauty. Her dark eyes held depths of grace and serenity that seemed to reach into every shadow of the room. Her skin glowed with an inner light that made the oil lamps seem dim in comparison. Her full lips curved in a gentle smile that spoke of confidence untouched by their previous cruelty. The laughter that had plagued the ceremony died abruptly, replaced by a stunned silence that rang louder than any whisper. Some of the women who had been most vocal in their mockery shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces flushing with shame. Boone gazed at his bride with undisguised pride, seeing not just her external beauty but the strength of spirit that had first drawn him to her. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a tender kiss to her fingers before leaning in to seal their vows with a proper kiss. The touch was gentle but sure, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Matthews declared, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that seemed to rebuke those who had come to scoff. The newly married couple turned to face their audience. The same faces that had twisted with mockery now struggled to meet their eyes. The transformation was stark. Where there had been cruel amusement, there was now uncomfortable awareness of their own small-mindedness. They walked down the aisle together, Boone's step matching Lydia's pace. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, but the sound seemed to have shed its earlier mocking tone. A few of the townspeople, shamefaced, nodded as they passed. Others simply stared, still trying to reconcile their prejudices with the reality before them. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. A small group of townsfolk gathered on the church steps, offering hesitant congratulations. Their words came slowly, weighted with the recognition of their earlier unkindness. "Lovely ceremony," murmured Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, who hours earlier had been among those laughing behind her fan. "Thank you kindly," Lydia replied, her voice carrying the same grace that illuminated her features. She accepted their belated good wishes with a dignity that made their previous behavior seem all the smaller. Yet not all hearts were softened by the revelation. Near the edge of the crowd, Clara Jenkins, the saloon-keeper's daughter, leaned close to Deputy Wade Kettering. Her whispered words carried spite sharp enough to cut through the general atmosphere of chastened goodwill. "She ain't what she seems," Clara hissed, her painted lips barely moving. "Mark my words, there's something not right about that woman." The deputy's eyes narrowed as they followed Boone helping Lydia into the wagon. His hand rested meaningfully on his badge as he watched them prepare to depart. Boone tucked a warm blanket around Lydia's legs, protection against the cooling mountain air. His movements were sure and tender, each gesture a silent promise of care. He checked the wagon's contents one final time, their few belongings packed carefully for the journey to their homestead in the highlands. The sun was setting now, painting the church steeple in gold and throwing long shadows across the dusty street. Boone climbed up beside his bride, gathering the reins in his practiced hands. The wagon wheels began to turn, carrying them away from the town's judgment and toward the promise of their shared life in the mountains. Behind them, the townsfolk of Calico Springs stood in varying states of discomfort and revelation, watching as the couple they had gathered to ridicule departed with more dignity than any of them had shown. The last rays of sunlight caught Lydia's profile as she sat tall beside her husband, her beauty undimmed by their earlier scorn, her presence a quiet rebuke to those who had judged so quickly and so poorly. The wagon wheels creaked steadily as Boone and Lydia left Calico Springs behind. Dust settled in their wake, while the setting sun painted the sky in deep purples and burning oranges. The town's judgmental whispers faded with each turning of the wheels, replaced by the gentle rustle of pine needles in the evening breeze. Boone held the reins with practiced ease, guiding their team along the winding mountain trail. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift to Lydia, taking in her profile against the darkening sky. The sight of her still filled him with wonder, not just her beauty, but the quiet strength she carried like a mantle. The path narrowed as they climbed higher into the mountains, threading between towering pines that reached toward heaven like ancient spires. Their branches swayed overhead, creating patterns of shadow and fading light across the wagon's canvas cover. The air grew cooler with the altitude, carrying the sharp scent of pine sap and distant snow. "Reckon we should make camp soon," Boone said softly, his voice rough but gentle. "There's a good spot ahead, near a spring, I know." Lydia nodded, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders. "That sounds wise. The horses could use the rest." The spot Boone had chosen lay in a small clearing, sheltered by a natural formation of rocks. A spring bubbled up from between moss-covered stones, its water crystal clear in the failing light. He helped Lydia down from the wagon, his calloused hands careful and sure. While Boone tended to the horses, Lydia moved with quiet efficiency, gathering what she needed from their supplies. She arranged a cooking space near where Boone was building the fire, her movements showing practiced skill. The flames soon caught, sending sparks dancing upward into the darkening sky. As Lydia worked with the cornmeal and cast iron skillet, Boone couldn't help but watch. Her hands moved with confidence, mixing and patting the dough into shape. From another bundle, she produced strips of seasoned venison, the meat already cured and ready for warming. "My father taught me to cook," she said, catching his interested gaze. "He said a meal should nourish both body and spirit." "Your father," Boone said carefully, settling nearby. "You mentioned he was a preacher?" Lydia's face softened with memory as she tended the cornbread. "Yes, a Cherokee preacher. He brought the word to our people, but he never asked us to forget who we were." Her hands stilled for a moment. "He taught me that God's truth could be spoken in any tongue, sung in any way." The fire crackled between them as she continued working. "He showed me how to blend the old songs with the new ones. Cherokee hymns that spoke of mountains and rivers, of the Great Spirit who became our Father through Christ." Boone listened intently, his usual reserve softening in the firelight. The aroma of cooking cornbread filled the air, mixing with the pine scent of the forest. Would you share one of those songs?" Lydia's smile warmed the gathering dark. As she worked, her voice lifted softly into the evening air, a melody that seemed to belong among the ancient trees. The words were Cherokee, flowing like water over stones, but the spirit of praise needed no translation. When the food was ready, Lydia arranged it carefully on their tin plates. The cornbread was golden brown, steam rising from its crusty surface. The venison, warmed over the fire, gave off an enticing aroma that reminded Boone how long it had been since their wedding meal. Before they ate, Lydia folded her hands and bowed her head. Boone, after a moment's hesitation, did the same. His voice was uncertain as he followed her lead in prayer, the words coming rough and halting. But Lydia's gentle tone carried them both, thanking the Creator for food, shelter, and their new life together. The meal was unlike anything Boone had eaten in his years of mountain living. The cornbread was light and flavorful, the venison perfectly seasoned. He found himself eating slowly, savoring each bite, watching as Lydia took small, dignified portions. "This is mighty fine cooking," he said, the words inadequate for what he felt. "Been a long time since I had a meal like this." "Food tastes better when shared," Lydia replied simply, but her eyes shone with pleasure at his praise. As night settled fully around them, Boone rose to check the horses one final time. When he returned, he began arranging his blanket carefully across the wagon's wooden floor. The thick wool would provide some comfort against the hard boards. "You'll sleep in the wagon," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "It's warm and dry. I'll keep watch by the fire." Lydia touched his arm gently. "Thank you, Boone. Your kindness means much to me." She paused, then added softly, "I know there will be challenges ahead, claiming my father's land. But I'm grateful not to face them alone." Boone helped her into the wagon, then settled himself near the fire, his rifle laid across his knees. The flames cast dancing shadows as he kept his vigil, alert to every sound in the darkness beyond their camp. From within the wagon, Lydia's voice rose once more in song. This time it was a hymn in English, the words speaking of God's guidance and protection. The melody drifted out into the night air, weaving through the branches overhead, bringing a peace that seemed to settle over their small camp like a blessing. In the distance, wolves began their nightly chorus, their howls echoing off the mountainsides. But their wild voices only made the sanctuary of the camp feel more secure. Boone's hands rested steady on his rifle, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Yet his expression was soft as he listened to Lydia's song, her voice a thread of grace in the vast wilderness around them. The fire popped and sparked, sending embers swirling upward to join the stars. Boone added another log, ensuring the flames would last through the night. The sound of Lydia's gentle breathing eventually replaced her singing, telling him she had found rest. He settled in for his watch, his heart fuller than he could remember it being in all his years of solitary wandering. After 5 days of steady travel through the mountain passes, Boone guided the wagon around a final bend. The horses' hooves crunched on patches of lingering snow as they crested the ridge. Below them, a valley opened up like a painting come to life, framed by towering peaks still crowned in white. "There it is," Boone said softly, reining the team to a halt. "Our home." Lydia leaned forward, her eyes bright with wonder. The cabin sat nestled against a backdrop of pine trees, its sturdy logs weathered to a soft gray. A clear stream curved past like a silver ribbon, its banks lined with early spring grass. Smoke-stained stones marked the chimney, rising straight and true against the azure sky. "Oh, Boone," Lydia breathed. "It's beautiful." Her gaze swept across the valley, taking in the natural meadow that stretched toward distant mountains. The Lord surely blessed this land. Boone's chest swelled with pride at her words. He'd built the cabin with his own hands 3 years ago, working through summer and fall to have it ready before the heavy snows. Now, with Lydia beside him, it finally felt like more than just shelter. It felt like home. The wagon creaked as they made their way down the gentle slope. As they drew closer, details emerged. The small vegetable plot he'd started last season, the stack of split logs against the cabin wall, the rough-hewn bench beneath the single window. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it, though somehow different now, charged with new possibility. They stopped before the cabin door. Boone helped Lydia down, his hands lingering slightly at her waist. She smiled up at him, then turned to survey what would be their home together. Her quiet dignity in that moment stirred something deep in his heart. "Best we get everything unloaded before sunset," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Nights still get mighty cold up here." They worked together with practiced efficiency, developed over their days of travel. Boone carried in the heavier supplies, flour barrels, tools, ammunition, while Lydia organized their household goods. She moved with purpose, transforming the sparse interior with small touches. A colorful quilted cloth on the table, tin cups arranged just so on wooden pegs. The cabin was simple but solid. One main room with a stone fireplace, a small sleeping loft above reached by a sturdy ladder. The furniture was basic: table, chairs, storage chest, all crafted by Boone's hands. Afternoon light slanted through the window, catching dust motes stirred up by their activity. While Boone went to chop more wood, Lydia took up a broom fashioned from bound twigs. She swept thoroughly, humming as she worked. The familiar hymn filled the cabin, making the space feel lived in, blessed. When the floors were clean, she reached into her personal trunk and withdrew a worn leather Bible. This was her father's most precious possession, its pages soft with use, margins filled with notes in both English and Cherokee. With reverent care, she placed it on the rough stone mantel. The book seemed to belong there, as if the spot had been waiting for just this purpose. Outside, the rhythmic sound of Boone's axe split the mountain air. Lydia moved to the doorway, watching him work. His powerful strokes made quick work of the logs, each piece falling cleanly. She smiled, remembering her father's words about the strength of a good man being a gift from the Creator. As evening approached, savory aromas filled the cabin. Lydia had prepared a proper supper: venison stew thick with vegetables, cornbread baked golden in the Dutch oven, wild berry preserves she'd brought from home. When Boone came in, the change in his expression at the sight of the laid table made her heart warm. They sat together, the first meal in their own home. Boone's usual reserve melted as Lydia shared stories of her childhood, her laughter bright in the formerly lonely room. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment all seemed right with their world. Before eating, they bowed their heads in prayer. But instead of the usual thanks, Boone's voice came rough with worry. "Lord," he said haltingly, "I fear for what's ahead. These mountain folks, they ain't always kind to those who're different." His hand found Lydia's across the table. "I don't want no harm coming to my wife because of how others see her heritage." Lydia's fingers tightened on his. "Boone," she said softly, her voice steady and sure, "God sees no divisions among his children. He looks upon the heart, not the face." She touched his cheek gently. "We must trust in his wisdom, not fear man's foolishness." The truth of her words seemed to settle something in Boone. He nodded, and they continued their meal in comfortable silence, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. Their peace was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Boone was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle. Lydia rose more slowly, her face composed but alert. The rider appeared out of the gathering dusk, Ed Slater, their nearest neighbor, though his ranch lay 5 miles distant. His weather-beaten face was set in hard lines as he reined his horse to a stop. Without waiting for a greeting, he fixed his gaze on Lydia. "Word travels fast, even up here," he said, his voice rough as trail gravel. "Heard tell a Cherokee preacher's daughter was laying claim to this piece of land." His eyes narrowed. "That true?" Lydia stepped forward, her chin lifted. "I am Reverend Walking Bear's daughter, yes, and this land was deeded to him legally 15 years ago." Boone moved to stand beside her, his presence protective, but not threatening. Slater ignored him, keeping his attention fixed on Lydia. "That so?" Slater spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Well, might interest you to know the railroad's been surveying this valley. They got plans." Big plans. His tone grew harder. Wouldn't want to waste time settling in somewhere you ain't gonna be able to stay. Lydia disappeared briefly into the cabin, returning with a folded document. This is the deed to this land, she said calmly, holding it out. Signed and registered with the territorial office. My father's name, and now mine as his heir, clear as day. Slater didn't even glance at the paper. He spat again, this time closer to their feet. Papers don't mean much when progress comes calling. Railroad's got friends in high places. He gathered his reins. Best remember that, both of you. Without another word, he wheeled his horse and rode away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Boone's hand tightened on his rifle, but Lydia laid her fingers gently on his arm. Come, she said softly. Our supper's getting cold. We won't let fear steal our joy in this blessing. They returned to their meal, but the easy peace of earlier had been replaced by something more determined. Through the window, they could see the last light fading from the snow-topped peaks, while closer at hand their cabin stood sturdy against the gathering night. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, mountain air sharp with the scent of pine. Boone watched Lydia pin her best bonnet in place, admiring how the blue ribbon matched her eyes. She'd pressed her Sunday dress careful-like the night before, smoothing every wrinkle with loving attention. You sure about this? Boone asked, helping her into the wagon. His voice carried the weight of worry. Folks might not be welcoming. Lydia settled her skirts, chin lifted with quiet determination. The Lord's house should be open to all his children, she said softly. My father taught me that. The wagon wheels creaked as they made their way down the mountain path. Lydia held tight to her hymnal, its leather cover worn smooth from years of use. Inside were songs in 2 languages, English and Cherokee, the pages marked with her father's careful notes. They arrived just as the church bell finished tolling. Other wagons and riders clustered around the modest clapboard building, their occupants filing inside with measured steps. Conversations died as Boone helped Lydia down. Eyes slid away, refusing to meet her gaze. Some women pulled their children closer, as if difference might be catching. Boone's jaw tightened, but Lydia's hand on his arm kept him steady. They walked up the wooden steps together, boots echoing in the sudden quiet. Inside, the morning sun streamed through plain glass windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The congregation parted like water, leaving empty pews to either side as Boone and Lydia made their way to a bench near the back. The wood creaked beneath them as they sat. Ahead, necks craned and whispers rustled like dry leaves. Pastor Miller stood at his pulpit, fingers drumming nervously on his Bible. His sermon spoke of loving thy neighbor, though his gaze never quite reached the back pew where Lydia sat. When time came for hymns, the organ wheezed to life, and the congregation rose stiffly. Lydia hesitated, her hymnal open but untouched. Then, as the first notes of Amazing Grace filled the air, she lifted her voice. The melody that emerged was not the familiar tune. Instead, it was an ancient Cherokee praise song, one her father had taught her as a child. The sound floated pure and clear to the rafters, strange yet beautiful. The congregation faltered, heads turned. Some faces showed shock, others curiosity. Lydia's voice carried on alone for a moment, then began to weave the Cherokee melody into the familiar hymn. The 2 songs merged together, becoming something new and profound. Mrs. Thompson, the baker's wife, was the first to join in again, her trembling soprano finding harmony with Lydia's sure notes. Others followed, voices uncertain at first, then growing stronger. The blended melody filled the church, rising up through the rafters like a prayer. Pastor Miller gripped his pulpit, tears streaming unashamed down his weathered cheeks. Even the stern-faced deacons seemed moved, their usual frowns softened by wonder. For those precious moments, the divisions between them melted away in shared song. When the last note faded, silence held for a heartbeat. Then, too, some women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Children stared at Lydia with open curiosity rather than fear. After the service, a few townspeople approached hesitantly to offer kind words. Mrs. Thompson pressed Lydia's hand, mumbling something about beautiful music. The smithy's wife asked if she might share her recipe for cornbread someday, yet others hurried past with cold shoulders and averted eyes. The saloon-keeper's daughter gathered her friends close, whispering behind raised fans. Their laughter held a sharp edge that cut through the morning peace. On the wagon ride home, Boone was unusually talkative. His big hands were gentle on the reins as he spoke. "Never heard nothing like that before," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Made me think different about things." Lydia glanced at him, questioning. "About us," he continued. "About this marriage. Reckon maybe it ain't just about ending our loneliness." He paused, searching for words. "Maybe. Maybe we're meant to help heal this valley somehow. Show folks different ain't always bad." Lydia smiled at his words, though shadows lingered in her dark eyes. She'd seen how some hearts remained closed, how hatred could root deep as mountain pine. Still, she reached for his hand, remembering her father's teachings about faith and patience. That evening, as sunset painted the mountains gold, a knock came at their cabin door. Outside stood Sarah Walsh, a young widow, with 3 small children huddled close to her skirts. Their clothes were trail-dusty, faces pinched with hunger. "Pardon the intrusion," Sarah said, voice wavering. "We're headed to my sister's place in Silverton. Been traveling 3 days, but our supplies ran short." Before she could finish, Lydia was ushering them inside. She sat the children at the table while Boone helped Sarah with her meager bags. Soon, the cabin filled with warmth and good smells as Lydia prepared a hearty supper. The youngest child, no more than 4, watched wide-eyed as Lydia moved about the kitchen. "You're pretty," she announced suddenly, "like a princess in them stories." Sarah hushed her daughter, embarrassed, but Lydia just laughed, a warm, welcoming sound. She served them generous portions of stew and fresh bread, making sure each child had seconds. After the meal, she wrapped extra provisions for their journey, ignoring Sarah's protests of inability to pay. "The Creator provides so we might share," Lydia said simply, pressing a packet of cornbread into Sarah's hands. The widow's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. Meanwhile, in town, Deputy Wade Kettering sat in the saloon's back room with 2 well-dressed railroad men. Smoke from expensive cigars hung thick in the air as they discussed business. "The Cherokee woman," Kettering said, tapping ash from his cigar. "She claims the land through her father's deed." His thin lips curved in a cruel smile. "But you know how unreliable such people can be. Papers get lost, records get confused." The railroad men exchanged knowing looks. "Any particular difficulties we should know about?" one asked, sliding a heavy envelope across the table. Kettering pocketed it without counting. "None worth mentioning. She'll be easy enough to discredit, after all." His voice dripped with contempt. "Who's going to take the word of a Cherokee over proper businessmen?" The men laughed, the sound ugly in the smoky room. Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the town's dusty streets. In the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that echoed unanswered through the valley. The mountain morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight spilling across the cabin's wooden floor. Lydia stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the lingering chill. In her hands, she cradled small clay pots filled with herb seedlings, gifts from her father's garden that she'd carefully transported in the wedding wagon. "These need good earth," she explained to Boone, who watched her with quiet curiosity. "Sage for healing, mint for tea, yarrow for fever." Her fingers traced the tender green shoots. "My father taught me their ways." Boone nodded, understanding how these plants connected her to both her Cherokee heritage and her father's memory. He'd already turned the soil near the cabin door, creating a small plot where the morning sun would warm the ground. While Lydia worked the earth with practiced hands, Boone hauled timber from the forest edge. The steady rhythm of his axe echoed through the valley as he split rails for the sagging fence line. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the cool air. Every so often he'd pause to watch Lydia tend her garden, her movements sure and graceful. By midday, the herb garden took shape. Neat rows of plants stood ready to grow, each variety marked with a smooth river stone. Lydia had painted Cherokee symbols on the stones, teaching Boone their meanings as she worked. "This one means healing," she said, touching a stone marked with flowing lines. "And this, wisdom." Her smile carried a hint of sadness. "Papa said wisdom grows best when planted in young hearts." As if summoned by her words, children's voices drifted up the path. 3 young ones from the nearest homestead appeared, the Miller children, faces dirty but eager. They'd been watching Lydia's planting from afar all morning. "Ma says you know stories," the oldest girl blurted, twisting her apron in nervous fingers. "From that big Bible there." Lydia's face brightened. She brushed dirt from her skirts and retrieved her father's Bible from inside. The leather binding was worn smooth with age, its pages marked with both English and Cherokee notes in her father's careful hand. "Would you like to hear one?" she asked, settling onto the bench by her new garden. The children nodded, creeping closer. Even Boone paused his work, leaning against his axe handle to listen. Lydia's voice carried clear and sweet as she read, explaining the harder words, showing the children how letters formed meaning. Soon, more young ones appeared, the Cooper twins from down the valley, then Shy Beth Watson from the next ridge over. They gathered in the cabin yard, drawn by Lydia's gentle teaching. Boone's chest swelled with quiet pride watching her. Here was the woman he'd married, not just beautiful, but wise and kind, sharing her father's legacy of learning with these mountain children who had so little schooling. Yet as afternoon shadows lengthened, movement on the ridge caught his eye. Riders moved along the crest, stopping often to peer through brass instruments mounted on tripods. Their fine clothes marked them as city men, not local ranchers. Boone's jaw tightened. Railroad surveyors. He'd seen their kind before, measuring land the company meant to take. They worked methodically, making notes and driving stakes topped with bright flags. The children had noticed them too, questions about the Bible forgotten as they pointed and whispered. Lydia followed their gaze, her hands tightening on the worn leather book. "Time to head home, young ones," she said softly. "Your mamas will be wanting you for supper." As the children scattered down the path, Boone strode to Lydia's side. "Railroad men," he growled, "measuring our land." Lydia's chin lifted. "Papa's deed is valid. This land was granted him for his service to both Cherokee and settler folk. He ministered to all, asked nothing in return except this piece of valley to call home." Boone squeezed her shoulder gently. "I'll ride into town, see what word's about." The general store was busy when he arrived. Clusters of townspeople gathered around the telegraph office window. A fresh yellow paper was tacked there, its message stark and official. Notice of intended railway construction. Colorado Western Line to proceed through. Calico Springs. Valley Stopland surveys. Commence immediately. Stop all claims to be. Verified by Railway Commission. Stop. Boone's heart sank. He'd seen this before, how the railway companies used their power to take what they wanted, how verification of land claims could drag on until folks gave up or were forced out. The ride home seemed longer than usual, darkness gathering in the valley as his horse picked its way along the familiar trail. Fresh survey stakes marked the path now, their flags ghostly in the dusk light. Lydia met him at the door, reading his expression before he could speak. "They mean to take it, don't they?" Boone nodded grimly, following her inside. The cabin glowed warm with lamplight, herb bundles already hanging from the rafters to dry. It felt like home. Their home, and his chest ached at the thought of losing it. "The deed is valid," Lydia repeated firmly, retrieving the precious document from its place beside her father's Bible. "Papa made sure everything was proper and legal. He knew," her voice caught. "He knew some would try to take it because of who we are." "Railroad don't care about proper or legal," Boone said heavily. "They've got money and lawyers. They'll find ways to delay, to question every detail." He ran a hand through his hair. "And some folks will be glad to see a Cherokee woman's claim dismissed." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. Fat flakes drifted past the window, gathering on the fresh-turned earth of Lydia's herb garden. The survey flags on the ridge snapped in the rising wind. Boone checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded before taking up position by the window. He'd seen how land disputes could turn ugly, how accidents could befall those who stood in the railway's way. Behind him, Lydia knelt by the fireplace, her father's Bible open before her. Her lips moved in silent prayer, asking for strength, for wisdom, for the courage to face whatever came. The firelight caught the tears on her cheeks, but her voice was steady as she whispered the ancient words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Boone kept his vigil as darkness settled fully over the valley. The snow fell thicker now, blanketing their small piece of paradise in white. His rifle lay ready across his knees, but his thoughts were on Lydia's quiet strength, on the children gathered in their yard, on the hope of building something good in this hard land. The night deepened. Lydia's prayers continued, mixing Cherokee and English in a soft stream of devotion. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the snowy ridges. Boone watched the darkness, protecting all they held dear, while behind him, Lydia's faith lit the cabin like a beacon against the gathering storm. 3 days after the snow, hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Boone looked up from mending a broken chair on the porch, his hand instinctively moving toward his rifle. Lydia paused in her bread-making, flour dusting her arms as she stepped to the doorway. Deputy Wade Kettering rode at the front, his tin star catching the weak winter sun. 2 strangers flanked him, both armed, their horses stamping in the fresh snow. Their fancy clothes marked them as railroad men, but their eyes held the hard look of hired guns. "Afternoon, Callahan," Kettering called, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Got some business to discuss about this here property." Boone stood slowly, positioning himself between the men and Lydia. "State your piece, Deputy." Kettering dismounted, boots crunching in the snow. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat, waving them like a flag. "Seems there's some question about the deed to this land. Railroad companies got prior claim, dated 5 years back." "That's not possible," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "My father was granted this land 7 years ago. We have the documentation." The deputy's smile turned cruel. "Now, ma'am, let's be realistic here. A Cherokee woman can't own land outright. It ain't natural, ain't legal neither." Boone's fingers tightened on his rifle stock. "Watch your tongue, Kettering. That's my wife you're speaking to." One of the railroad men spat into the snow. "Marriage don't change what she is, or what she ain't." Lydia stepped forward, dignity wrapped around her like a cloak. "My father's deed bears the territorial governor's seal. It's registered properly in the land office." "That so?" Kettering unfolded his papers with a flourish. "These documents say different. Show this whole valley was deeded to the Colorado Western Railway Company back in '68, signed and sealed, all official-like." Boone moved closer, studying the papers. The ink looked fresh, the edges too crisp for documents supposedly 5 years old. "Those are forged," he growled, "just like your badge is borrowed." The deputy's face darkened. "Careful, Callahan. Wouldn't want any unfortunate accidents out here in the wild country." His hand rested meaningfully on his gun belt. "Railroad's getting this land, one way or another. Best pack up peaceful-like while you can." "The Lord sees your lies," Lydia said softly. "My father taught both Cherokee and settler children to read his word. He served this community faithfully until the day he died." "Your preacher papa's dead and gone," Kettering sneered, "and his claim died with him." "We'll be back. Mrs. Callahan count on it." He turned to his horse, then paused. "Oh, and them kids you've been teaching? Might want to send them home permanent. Shame if anything happened to them on these dangerous mountain trails." The three men mounted up, their horses' hooves cutting dark scars in the pristine snow as they rode away. Boone watched until they disappeared over the ridge, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Inside," he said gently to Lydia. "Weather's turning cold." They settled by the fire, its warmth doing little to chase the chill from their bones. Lydia's hands shook as she poured coffee into tin cups. The bread dough lay forgotten on the table, deflating in its bowl. "There's something I need to tell you," she said finally, setting down the coffee pot. "Something I've kept safe, waiting for the right moment." Boone took her trembling hands in his. "What is it, love?" "My wedding veil." Lydia's eyes held a mix of hope and fear. "Before Papa died, he gave me papers, important ones, documents proving our right to this land, with signatures from tribal leaders and territorial officials both. I sewed them into the hem of my veil, kept them close until I could trust they'd be safe." Understanding dawned in Boone's eyes. "That's why you insisted on wearing it that day, even with all their mockery." Lydia nodded. "Papa knew there would be those who'd try to take our land. He said to guard the papers well, share them only when absolutely necessary." She squeezed his hands. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but you needed to be sure of me first," Boone finished. "You were right to wait. Kettering's got powerful friends. If word of those papers gets out too soon—" "They might disappear," Lydia whispered. "Like so many Cherokee documents have before." Boone pulled her close, breathing in the scent of flower and herbs that clung to her hair. "We'll keep them hidden a while longer. Let Kettering and his railroad friends think they have us beaten. Sometimes the Lord's justice works best when the wicked are confident in their schemes." They sat quietly for a time, watching the fire dance. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows. Lydia stirred first, moving to salvage what she could of the bread dough. "We should eat," she said practically. "Keep up our strength." Boone nodded, setting about helping her prepare their evening meal. It was simple fare. Bean soup with the rescued bread, stretched with the last of their dried venison. But as they bowed their heads to pray, the food seemed a feast. "No man will take this land," Boone declared suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "Not while I draw breath. This is your father's legacy, our home. God's given us this valley to tend, and tend it we will." Lydia reached across the table, laying her small hand over his large, calloused one. Her touch held all the quiet courage that had drawn him to her, all the faith that sustained her through hardship and loss. "We'll face what comes together," she said softly, "with truth as our shield and the Lord as our strength." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light over their simple meal. Outside, snow began falling again, covering the tracks left by Kettering and his men. But inside the cabin, hope burned bright as Boone and Lydia shared their bread and soup, drawing strength from each other's presence and their shared trust in divine justice. The winter wind howled across the valley, sharp as a knife's edge. Inside their cabin, Boone stoked the fire while Lydia knelt by their youngest calf, wrapped in burlap against the cold. The small barn couldn't fully shield their livestock from the bitter mountain winter. "Come on, little one," Lydia murmured, rubbing the calf's legs to keep blood flowing. Her breath clouded in the frigid air. "Just a few more hours till dawn." Boone watched his wife work, her gentle hands never tiring. They'd already lost 2 chickens to the cold, and their hay stores were running low. but Lydia refused to give up on any creature in her care. "You should rest," he said softly. "I can tend to the animals." She shook her head, dark hair escaping her shawl. "The Lord entrusted these creatures to us. We must be faithful in small things to be worthy of greater trust." A pounding at their cabin door interrupted them. Sarah Miller, one of their closest neighbors, stood in the doorway, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Please," she gasped. "My Tommy's burning with fever. The doctor's snowed in at Preston's Creek. I don't know what to do." Lydia was already gathering her herb bag. "Boone, watch the calf. I'll go with Sarah." He caught her arm. "The trail's dangerous at night." "Then the Lord will light our way," she said simply, kissing his cheek. Boone watched the two women disappear into the darkness, their lantern a tiny flame against the vast night. He turned back to the calf, praying as Lydia had taught him. For 3 days, Lydia barely slept, tending young Tommy through his fever. Word spread through the valley. The Cherokee preacher's daughter had saved the Miller boy when the doctor couldn't reach him. Soon, other families came seeking help. Lydia never turned anyone away. She taught scripture to children gathered around her kitchen table, sharing bread and dried apples as they learned their letters. When Widow Hanson's roof leaked, Lydia shared their precious flour. When the Browns lost their milk cow, she gave them cheese from her own stores. One evening, as Boone returned from checking their fence line, he found 3 women from town helping Lydia mend quilts. Their laughter rang out warm and genuine, the same women who had once whispered cruel jokes about his fat bride. "Your wife's a blessing to this valley," Mrs. Brown told him later, as she left with a jar of preserved peaches. "We were wrong about her, Mr. Callahan, dead wrong." But not everyone's heart had softened. That Saturday, Boone and Lydia walked to town for supplies. In the general store, Ruby Fletcher, the saloon-keeper's daughter, held court among her friends. "Well, if it ain't the happy couple," Ruby drawled as they entered. "Though I reckon some marriages ain't exactly what they seem." Boone felt Lydia stiffen beside him. They tried to ignore the whispers as they gathered their purchases. "Mighty convenient, ain't it?" Ruby's voice carried clearly. "A lonely mountain man, valuable land, and a desperate Cherokee woman needing somewhere to belong. Makes you wonder who trapped who." The store fell silent. Boone set down the sack of cornmeal he'd been holding. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried to every corner. "My wife didn't trap me, Miss Fletcher. She saved me." He turned to face the crowd. "I was lost in my own darkness before I met her. Her faith, her kindness, they gave me back my soul." His hand found Lydia's, squeezing gently. "I love her more than life itself, and I'd be obliged if you'd show her the respect she deserves." Ruby's face flushed red. She fled the store, her friends trailing behind her. Old Mr. Jenkins, the shopkeeper, cleared his throat. "Your order's on the house today, folks," he said gruffly. "And Mrs. Callahan, thank you for helping my grandson with his reading." The walk home under the stars felt lighter somehow. Lydia's hand stayed tucked in Boone's as they climbed the snowy path. "You didn't have to defend me," she said softly. "Yes, I did." He stopped, turning to face her. "Everything I said was true. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Lydia May Callahan." She reached up to touch his cheek, her eyes shining. But before she could speak, a flicker of light caught her attention. Torchlight, moving near their homestead. "No," Boone breathed. He broke into a run, Lydia close behind. They crested the hill just in time to see riders circling their corral. In the torchlight, Deputy Kettering's badge gleamed as his men swung axes at the fence posts. Their cattle, panicked by the commotion, stampeded through the broken sections. "Stop!" Boone's voice thundered across the valley, but the raiders were already driving the cattle away, whooping and shouting as they scattered the herd. Lydia ran toward the cabin. The door hung broken on its hinges. Inside, drawers had been dumped, furniture overturned. Her father's Bible lay in the wreckage, its pages torn and muddy. She fell to her knees in the snow, clutching the ruined book to her chest. Tears froze on her cheeks as she tried to smooth the crumpled pages. Boone knelt beside her, pulling her close. His body trembled with rage, but his touch remained gentle. "They think they can break us," he said fiercely. "Think they can drive us off our land with their bullying and destruction." He helped her stand, brushing snow from her skirts. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." Lydia looked up at him, her eyes steel beneath her tears. "We will not yield," she whispered. "This land was my father's dream, a place where all God's children could live in peace. I won't let them destroy that dream." Together they surveyed the damage. The corral lay in splinters. Their cattle were scattered across the valley. The cabin's windows were broken, letting in the bitter wind. But the foundation stood firm, like their faith in each other. Boone gathered wood to board up the windows, while Lydia salvaged what she could inside. As she worked, her voice rose in a Cherokee hymn, one her father had sung in times of trouble. The melody carried across the snow-covered valley, a declaration of defiance against the darkness. "We'll rebuild," Boone said as they huddled close that night, watching the stars through the broken roof. "Everything they destroyed, we'll make stronger." Lydia nodded, her head resting on his shoulder. "The Lord tests our faith through trials," she murmured, "but he never abandons his children." In the distance, wolves howled, perhaps tracking their scattered cattle. But Boone and Lydia held each other close, their love and determination burning brighter than any torch the raiders carried. As the night deepened, they prayed together, not for vengeance, but for strength, for wisdom, for the courage to stand firm against the storms that were surely coming. Their words mingled with the wind, rising like smoke to the winter sky, while all around them the valley held its breath, waiting for dawn. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber and rose, but Boone Callahan found no beauty in the morning light. He stood amid the wreckage of their corral, counting the cost of last night's raid. Splintered fence posts jutted from the earth like broken bones. Trampled snow revealed where their cattle had scattered, driven off by the deputy's men. His fingers traced bullet holes in the barn door. Each mark felt like a personal insult, stoking the rage that had kept him awake through the night. The sound of singing drew his attention to the barn, where Lydia's voice drifted out soft and clear. Inside, she knelt beside their wounded milk cow, Emma. The animal had been too slow to run with the herd, taking a harsh beating from the raiders' whips. Lydia pressed a poultice of herbs against the cow's flank, humming a Cherokee healing song as she worked. "How is she?" Boone asked, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "The cuts are deep, but with God's grace she'll heal." Lydia smoothed her hand over Emma's neck. "The young calf needs tending too." His leg was injured in the stampede. Boone's jaw clenched. "I know who needs tending. That deputy and his gang of thieves. They need to answer for this." "Violence will only breed more violence," Lydia said quietly, rising to face him. Her skirts were stained with mud and medicine, but her eyes held steady wisdom. "We must seek justice through proper channels." "Proper channels?" Boone scoffed. "The law in this town belongs to the railroad. You saw how they treated us before." Lydia stepped closer, laying her hand against his chest. Through his shirt, she could feel his heart hammering with suppressed fury. "I saw fear in their eyes, not strength. They attack because they know their claims are false." "Then let me show them real fear," Boone growled. "One night, that's all I need. I'll make them regret ever touching our land." "And then what?" Lydia's voice sharpened. "You'll end up in jail, or worse. The railroad will still take our land, and I'll be alone." Her fingers gripped his shirt. "Please, husband. Trust in the Lord's path, not the devil's temptation." Boone looked down at her hand, remembering how it had trembled in his during their wedding vows. Such a gentle hand, yet it held more strength than his trigger finger ever could. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally. "We ride into town. We demand justice openly, in the light of day." She smiled slightly. "After all, we have nothing to hide." An hour later, they rode down Main Street, Boone on his stallion and Lydia in their remaining wagon. Townsfolk stopped to stare, some ducking into doorways to avoid meeting their eyes. News of the raid had traveled fast. They found Deputy Kettering lounging outside the jail, boots propped on the rail. His smirk widened as they approached. "Well, if it ain't the happy homesteaders," he drawled. "Rough night?" Boone dismounted, his spurs ringing against the wooden sidewalk. "You know damn well what kind of night it was. You led that raid yourself." "Raid?" The deputy's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Why, I was playing cards at the saloon all evening. Ask anyone inside, though I did hear some talk about trespassers being cleared from railroad property." "That land belongs to my wife," Boone said, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "Her father's deed proves it." Kettering laughed, the sound drawing onlookers from the street. "A Cherokee woman claiming white man's land? That's a good joke." His eyes narrowed. "Almost as good as her imaginary rights to be there at all." Boone's vision went red. His fingers closed around his pistol grip, ready to end the deputy's sneering once and for all. But before he could draw, Lydia stepped between them. She raised her hands to heaven, her voice carrying clear and strong through the morning air. "Lord, grant us strength in this hour of trial. Help those who persecute us see the truth in their hearts. Guide us all toward justice, not vengeance." Her prayer cut through the tension like a knife through butter. The gathering crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several women bowed their heads, moved by her words. Even the deputy's smirk faltered. "Amen," came a quiet voice. The Reverend Matthews stepped forward from the crowd, his Bible clutched to his chest. "Mrs. Callahan speaks wisdom. This is a matter for proper legal channels, not violence. The county courthouse in Silver Creek handles land disputes," the pastor continued, addressing Boone directly. "Judge Parker is a fair man. He'll hear your case without prejudice." Kettering's face darkened. "The railroad's lawyers can present their case there as well," the pastor interrupted firmly, "in front of witnesses and the law." Boone felt Lydia's hand slip into his, gently pulling him back from the precipice of violence. He forced his fingers to release his gun, though every instinct screamed for revenge. "We'll ride to Silver Creek," he ground out. "But this isn't over, Deputy." "No," Kettering agreed, his smile turning cruel. "It surely ain't." They gathered supplies for the journey, accepting a few sympathetic offerings from townsfolk who had been touched by Lydia's prayer. As the sun began to set, they made camp several miles outside town, beside a creek lined with winter bare cottonwoods. Boone built a fire while Lydia prepared a simple supper of cornbread and beans. The familiar routine helped calm his racing thoughts, though anger still simmered beneath the surface. After they ate, Lydia brought out her wedding veil by lamplight. Boone watched her capable hands work the needle, reinforcing the hem where her father's precious papers lay hidden. "You could have let me shoot him," he said finally. "No one would have blamed me after what they did." Lydia didn't look up from her sewing. "The Lord would have known. And so would you, in your heart. Sometimes I reckon your heart knows better than mine." "Not better," she corrected gently. "Just different. Your strength protects us, but strength without wisdom is like a wild horse without a bridle, dangerous to friend and foe alike." Boone moved to sit beside her, watching the firelight dance across her face. The same face that had stunned the town into silence on their wedding day now glowed with inner peace, despite all they had endured. "I'm not sure I have your kind of wisdom," he admitted, "or your faith." Faith grows like a seed, she said, tying off her thread. It needs good soil, water, and patience. She smiled at him. You have more than you know, husband. I've seen it growing these past months. Boone took her hand, marveling at how such delicate fingers could possess such iron resolve. His own hands were made for violence, catching fur, throwing punches, pulling triggers. Yet here was his wife, showing him a different kind of strength. I'll follow your lead on this, he said quietly. Not because I think it's right, but because I trust you more than I trust my own anger. Lydia leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. Together they watched the fire dance, while overhead the stars wheeled in their ancient paths, indifferent to the struggles of those below. Tomorrow they would ride for Silver Creek and the courthouse. Tomorrow they would face the railroad's lawyers and the deputies' lies. But tonight, beside the fire, Boone held his wife close and felt his rage slowly transform into something steadier, a determination to prove worthy of her faith in him, in justice, and in the power of prayer over violence. Dawn broke cold and gray as Boone and Lydia loaded their wagon for the journey to Silver Creek. The mountain air bit sharp, and patches of dirty snow still clung to the shadows. Boone wrapped an extra blanket around Lydia's shoulders before helping her up onto the wagon seat. It will be slow going, he warned, eyeing the muddy track ahead. 3 days at least, if the weather holds. Lydia nodded, clutching her father's Bible close. The Lord will see us through. They set out as the sun climbed higher, their wagon wheels cutting deep ruts in the half-frozen earth. Boone sat tall beside his wife, scanning the ridgelines for trouble. The railroad men might try to delay them, or worse, his rifle lay ready across his knees. The first day passed quietly enough. They followed the winding mountain road down through stands of pine and aspen. Lydia hummed hymns softly as they traveled, her voice carrying on the wind. Sometimes Boone found himself humming along, though he barely knew the words. That evening, they made camp in a sheltered hollow. While Boone tended the horses, Lydia prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The familiar routine brought comfort, despite the uncertainty ahead. Tell me about Silver Creek, Lydia said as they ate. Have you been there before? Boone nodded, chewing thoughtfully. Twice. It's bigger than Calico Springs. Fancier too. Lots of brick buildings and painted storefronts. He paused. And more railroad men. But also more law, Lydia reminded him. Real law, not bought men like Deputy Kettering. We'll see. Boone wasn't convinced, but he kept his doubts to himself. The second day brought harder travel. Spring thaws had turned the mountain passes treacherous. Their wagon creaked and groaned as Boone guided it carefully around washouts and over icy patches. Lydia gripped the seat beside him, praying quietly when the wheels slipped. Near midday, they came upon a sorry sight. A family's wagon sat tilted in the road, its back axle splintered. A man and his wife huddled with 3 small children beside their stranded belongings, looking lost and cold. We have to help them, Lydia said immediately. Boone frowned. We're burning daylight as it is. The courthouse dash. We'll still be there tomorrow. Lydia's tone brooked no argument. These people need us now. Sighing, Boone pulled their wagon to a stop. The stranded family watched warily as he approached. A father about Boone's age, his wife, and 3 children under 10 years old. Looks like you could use a hand, Boone said. The man straightened, pride warring with desperation. Axle snapped 2 hours ago. We're headed to my brother's place in Pine Valley, but now, he gestured helplessly at the broken wagon. My husband is good with repairs, Lydia called, climbing down from their wagon. She smiled warmly at the mother and children. I'm Lydia Callahan, and this is Boone. Let's see what we can do to help. While Boone examined the damage, Lydia opened their food stores. Soon she had the children eating hot cornbread, while their mother helped her prepare soup. The father, Thomas Miller was his name, assisted Boone in finding a sturdy pine branch to splice the broken axle. "It won't last forever," Boone warned as they worked, "but it should get you to Pine Valley." "We're much obliged," Miller said quietly. "Truth is, we've got nothing to pay you with." "The Lord asks us to help our neighbors," Lydia said, ladling out soup. "No payment needed." They shared the meal together, the children's spirits lifting as their bellies filled. Afterward, Miller's wife Sarah brought out her own Bible, and the families prayed together beside the wagon. "Lord, thank you for sending angels of mercy to help us in our need," Sarah prayed, her voice thick with emotion. "Bless the Callahans on their journey wherever it leads." The simple prayer touched something in Boone's heart. Here were good people, helping each other without thought of gain or loss. Just as Lydia had said, neighbors caring for neighbors, as God intended. They parted ways as afternoon shadows lengthened, the Miller family continuing west while Boone and Lydia pressed on toward Silver Creek. That night by the campfire, Boone watched his wife sewing by lamplight, mending a tear in her shawl. "You were right about helping them," he admitted. "It felt proper." Lydia smiled without looking up from her work. "The Lord often speaks through our hearts, if we listen. Those children reminded me of what we're really fighting for." "What do you mean?" She set aside her sewing, meeting his eyes across the flames. "Not just land, or even justice. We're fighting for a future, a place where our own children can grow up free from fear and hatred." Boone's breath caught. They hadn't spoken much about children, though he'd seen how she doted on the little ones who came for Bible lessons. "You want that?" he asked softly. "A family with me?" "Of course I do." Lydia moved to sit beside him, taking his rough hand in hers. "I want to fill our cabin with love and laughter. To teach our babies the old hymns, to watch you show them how to track deer and build fences." She squeezed his fingers. "But first we need to secure our home." Boone pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I never thought I'd marry," he confessed. "Figured it was just a burden, something that would slow me down. But you—" He struggled to find the words. "You make me stronger. Better." "That's what marriage should be," Lydia murmured. "Two hearts joining to lift each other closer to God." They held each other as the fire burned low, sharing dreams of the future they would build together, if they could win tomorrow's battle. The third day brought them within sight of Silver Creek. The town sprawled across a wide valley, its buildings grander than anything in Calico Springs. The courthouse rose above it all, a 3-story brick edifice with white columns and tall windows. But Boone's heart sank as they approached. Railroad men lounged on the courthouse steps, their guns visible on their hips. They watched Boone and Lydia's wagon with predatory interest. "They're trying to frighten us," Lydia observed calmly. "It's working," Boone admitted through clenched teeth. They pulled the wagon to a stop before the courthouse steps. Boone helped Lydia down, noting how the railroad men straightened, hands drifting toward their weapons. His own fingers itched for his rifle, but Lydia's touch steadied him. "God goes before us," she reminded him softly. Her other hand pressed against her wedding veil, where her father's precious documents lay hidden. Boone took a deep breath, covering her hand with his. Together they mounted the courthouse steps, ignoring the sneers and whispers of the railroad men. The heavy oak doors seemed to grow larger as they approached, like the gates of a fortress they had to breach. But Lydia's hand remained steady in his as they pushed through those doors, ready to face whatever waited within. Their future, and the future of their dreams, hung on what would happen in the next few hours. The cool darkness of the courthouse engulfed them as they stepped inside, moving toward the judge's bench that would decide their fate. Inside the Silver Creek courthouse, Dust motes danced in shafts of morning light streaming through tall windows. The room smelled of wood polish and leather-bound law books. Wooden benches creaked as townsfolk settled in to watch the proceedings, their whispers echoing off the high ceiling. Judge Elias Whitmore sat stern-faced behind his massive oak bench, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. Before him, Boone stood tall in his cleanest shirt, though trail dust still clung to his boots. "Your Honor," Boone began, his voice rough with emotion, "my wife Lydia and I come before you today to defend our rightful claim to our homestead in Calico Valley." The deputy's boots clicked against the floorboards as he strode forward, flanked by two men in expensive suits, railroad lawyers with leather portfolios tucked under their arms. Their polished appearance made Boone's worn clothes seem shabbier by comparison. "Your Honor," one lawyer said smoothly, "this is a simple matter of invalid documentation. The supposed deed Mrs. Callahan claims cannot possibly be legitimate." The second lawyer pulled out several papers. "Furthermore, we have evidence that the railroad's claim to that land predates any other." He shot a smug glance at Lydia. Deputy Kettering stepped forward, his badge gleaming. "And there's the matter of her heritage, Your Honor. The law is clear about Indian ownership rights." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Boone's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. The casual cruelty in their voices when they spoke about Lydia made his blood boil. But Lydia herself remained perfectly calm. She rose slowly from her seat, her movements graceful and deliberate. The morning light caught the beading on her wedding veil, making it shimmer. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "if I may approach—" Judge Whitmore nodded, watching intently as Lydia stepped forward. The railroad lawyers exchanged knowing smirks, clearly expecting nothing of consequence from this woman they had already dismissed. With careful fingers, Lydia reached for her wedding veil. The delicate fabric rustled as she lifted it from her head, revealing her face to the packed courtroom. But instead of setting the veil aside, she turned it over in her hands, examining the hem with purpose. The deputy's smirk faltered slightly as he watched her movements. Lydia's fingers found a nearly invisible seam in the fabric, and with precise movements she began to pull the stitches free. The courtroom fell silent, save for the soft sound of thread giving way. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, curiosity evident in his stern features. From within the carefully sewn hem, Lydia withdrew several folded papers, yellowed with age but clearly preserved with great care. Her hands were steady as she unfolded them, smoothing the creases with reverence. "These documents," she said clearly, "belonged to my father, Reverend John Ross Walking Path. He entrusted them to me before his death, knowing there might come a day when our claim would be challenged." She stepped forward and presented the papers to the judge. The railroad lawyers surged forward, but Judge Whitmore silenced them with a sharp look. "Let me see those papers," he commanded, reaching for his spectacles. The documents crackled as he unfolded them carefully. His eyes narrowed as he studied the first page, then widened slightly. He lifted the paper closer, examining something in the corner. "This seal," he murmured. "This is the mark of the U.S. Indian agent for the territory." Deputy Kettering's face had gone pale. "That's impossible," he sputtered. "She's trying to trick—" "Silence!" Judge Whitmore's voice cracked like a whip. He held up the document, pointing to various marks upon it. "This deed is properly registered and witnessed. The seal is genuine. I've seen enough of them to know. And the date." He peered closer. "This claim predates the railroad survey by nearly 5 years." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The railroad lawyers began talking all at once, their voices rising in protest. "Your Honor, surely you can't accept—" "The legal precedent clearly states—" "This is outrageous! We demand dash." Judge Whitmore's gavel crashed down, the sharp crack silencing the chaos. "I will have order in this court," he thundered. When quiet fell again, he continued more calmly. These documents appear entirely legitimate. The seal of the Indian agent is undeniable, and all proper procedures were followed in registering this claim. Boone stepped closer to Lydia, taking her hand. Her fingers were warm and steady in his grip. Pride swelled in his chest as he watched her stand tall before these men who had tried to destroy them. The deputy's face had moved from pale to red, sweat beading on his forehead. "But, Your Honor," he tried one last time, "surely you can't allow—" "Deputy Kettering," Judge Whitmore cut him off sharply, "I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. These documents raise serious questions about certain other papers that have crossed my bench recently, papers bearing your signature." Kettering's mouth snapped shut, and he took an involuntary step backward. The railroad lawyers huddled together, whispering furiously. Around the courtroom, townsfolk who had come to watch the proceedings were muttering among themselves, many nodding approvingly at Lydia. Judge Whitmore studied the documents for several more minutes while the tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, he looked up, his expression grave. "Having examined these documents thoroughly," he announced, "I find them to be genuine and binding. The seal of the U.S. Indian agent carries the full weight of federal authority, and this deed was properly registered according to all territorial laws." He fixed the railroad lawyers with a stern gaze. Any attempt to override or invalidate this claim would constitute a serious breach of federal law. Relief flooded through Boone so strongly his knees nearly buckled. Lydia's hand tightened in his, and when he looked down at her, tears shone in her eyes. But her smile was radiant. The railroad men were not finished, however. The senior lawyer stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "Your Honor, the railroad's interests in this territory are paramount. Surely some arrangement could be." "The law is the law," Judge Whitmore interrupted firmly. "This deed is valid. The land belongs to Mrs. Callahan, inherited from her father and now shared with her husband." He gathered the documents carefully. "These will be copied into county records immediately, with my seal affirming their legitimacy." Boone watched the railroad men's faces carefully, noting the fury in their eyes. They might have lost this battle, but powerful men unused to defeat could be dangerous. Still, for this moment at least, justice had prevailed. Around them, the courtroom had erupted in conversation. Several townsfolk approached to offer congratulations, including some who had traveled from Calico Springs to witness the proceedings. Lydia accepted their words graciously, though Boone could feel the slight tremor in her hand that betrayed her emotion. Deputy Kettering had slunk away, no doubt already planning how to explain this failure to his railroad masters. The lawyers gathered their papers with sharp movements, shooting venomous glances at Boone and Lydia as they departed. Judge Whitmore's voice rose above the noise. "Mrs. Callahan, please remain a moment. I'll have the clerk prepare official copies for your records." He smiled slightly. "It seems you inherited not only your father's land, but also his wisdom in protecting it." Lydia carefully folded her wedding veil, the now empty hem a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. "My father taught me that justice may take time," she said softly, "but God's truth will always come to light." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Deputy Kettering's face twisted with rage as he lunged forward, pointing an accusing finger at Lydia. "She forged those papers," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "That seal ain't genuine." "Order!" Judge Whitmore's gavel crashed down repeatedly, the sharp cracks echoing off the courthouse walls. "I will have order in this court." The deputy wasn't finished. His eyes wild with desperation, he reached into his coat. "I have proof right here that she—" "Deputy Kettering." Judge Whitmore's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "These documents you presented earlier." He held up a stack of papers. "Would you care to explain why they bear 3 different types of ink, though they're supposedly from the same day?" The color drained from Kettering's face. The railroad lawyers began edging away from him, distancing themselves as Judge Whitmore continued. "Furthermore, I have here telegrams from the territorial office confirming that these supposed transfer documents were never registered." The judge's stern gaze swept the courtroom. "What I do have is clear evidence of fraud, perpetrated by an officer of the law." Two county marshals stepped forward, their badges glinting in the morning light streaming through the high windows. "Deputies," Judge Whitmore commanded, "take Mr. Kettering into custody on charges of attempting to defraud this court. You can't do this." Kettering tried to back away, but the marshals caught his arms. The click of handcuffs echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. "The railroad won't stand for this." "The railroad," Judge Whitmore declared firmly, "will abide by the law like everyone else." He lifted Lydia's documents. "These papers are valid, properly registered, and certified by federal authority. This deed grants clear title to Mrs. Lydia May Callahan, inherited from her father and now shared with her husband." The judge's gavel fell one final time. "This case is closed. The land belongs to the Callahans." Boone's shoulders sagged as the tension drained from his body. He felt lightheaded with relief, barely noticing as the railroad lawyers gathered their papers and fled the courthouse, their grand plans crumbling to dust. Beside him, Lydia wept quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks as she carefully took the papers from Judge Whitmore. Her fingers trembled as she traced her father's signature. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered. "You protected us even after you were gone." The townsfolk who had packed the courtroom began filing past. Many who had once turned away from Lydia now nodded respectfully. Some even paused to offer quiet congratulations. The pastor stepped forward to shake Boone's hand, then turned to Lydia. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. "You've shown us all what true dignity looks like." Outside, snow had begun falling, fat flakes drifting lazily from a pearl-gray sky. The courthouse steps were already dusted white, like sugar on a wedding cake. Boone helped Lydia down the slippery steps, supporting her with gentle hands. Their wagon waited at the hitching post, the horses stamping impatiently in the cold. Boone lifted Lydia onto the seat with careful reverence, tucking a blanket around her legs before climbing up beside her. "You did it," he said softly, gathering the reins. "Your faith never wavered." Lydia leaned against his shoulder. "We did it together," she corrected. "Justice has stood taller than any rifle, just as you said." They rode home slowly, both too exhausted for haste. The wagon wheels creaked through fresh snow, marking their passage through the hushed landscape. Neither spoke much, but their silence was comfortable, filled with shared relief and gratitude. As they passed scattered homesteads, people emerged from cabin doors and barn doorways. Word of their victory had somehow raced ahead of them. Neighbors who had kept their distance now stepped forward to cheer and wave. Old Widow Carson hurried out with a basket of fresh bread. "For your supper," she called. "You must be worn to the bone." Further along, the Miller family flagged them down. "We saved 2 heifers from your scattered herd," Mr. Miller said. "They're yours whenever you're ready to collect them." The Andersons offered lumber to rebuild their corral. The Wilsons promised chickens to replace those lost in the raid. Again and again, neighbors stepped forward with help and support. As if their victory had broken down invisible walls between them, Lydia accepted each offer with grace, her eyes shining. "The Lord provides," she murmured to Boone. "Sometimes through the hands of neighbors we didn't know we had." As they crested the final ridge, their homestead came into view. The cabin stood solid against the mountainside, though the yard still showed signs of the deputies' raid. Broken fence rails lay scattered in the snow, and the corral gaped open like a missing tooth. But the damage couldn't dim their joy. Dawn was breaking over the valley, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Smoke curled from their chimney where neighbors had kept the home fires burning in their absence. "Look," Lydia said softly, pointing to fresh tracks in the snow. "Someone's been caring for the remaining livestock." Boone nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He had lived so long believing he had to stand alone against the world. Now he understood what Lydia had been teaching him all along, that faith could build bridges stronger than any barrier. The wagon rolled to a stop before their cabin door. Their home might be battered, but it still stood proud. Like them, it had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. Lydia reached for Boone's hand as the sun crested the mountains, flooding the valley with light. "Faith carried us through," she whispered, "just as it always will." Boone helped her down from the wagon, drawing her close for a moment. Together they stood in the fresh snow, watching dawn paint their hard-won land in colors of promise and hope. Their home waited before them, damaged but standing, ready to be restored. Just as their victory had restored more than just their claim to the land. It had restored their neighbors' faith in justice, their community's belief in doing right, and their own trust that love could bridge any divide. The sun climbed higher, making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds across their valley. Their valley, one not with violence but with patience, faith, and the power of truth. Dawn had indeed broken over more than just the land. It had broken over their hearts as well, washing away the shadows of fear and doubt. Dawn painted the valley gold as Boone hauled fresh-cut timber toward their damaged corral, his breath frosted in the crisp morning air, muscles straining against the weight. The sound of hammering echoed across the snow-covered ground as Tom Miller and his sons worked to repair the broken fence rails. "Much obliged for the help," Boone called out, dropping the logs beside them. Tom wiped his brow, grinning. "Ain't nothing. Way I figure, we all stood quiet too long while injustice worked its way through this valley. Time to make that right." From the cabin, the sweet aroma of baking bread drifted on the winter breeze. Lydia and several neighbor women were inside, their voices carrying softly through the open door as they worked to restore order to the ransacked home. Boone paused, watching smoke curl from the chimney. Just weeks ago, he'd felt so alone in this valley. Now the homestead bustled with helping hands and friendly faces. The Lord did work in mysterious ways, just as Lydia always said. "Pa! Pa!" Young Billy Anderson came running up the path, his face flushed with excitement. "We found 2 more of your cattle down by the creek. Ma says to tell you they're safe in our barn whenever you're ready." Boone ruffled the boy's hair. "Tell your ma we're grateful. Seems half our herd has found shelter with kind neighbors." Inside the cabin, Lydia arranged chairs around the hearth, while Sarah Wilson helped sweep away the last signs of the raid. The mantle had been carefully restored, Lydia's father's Bible once again holding its place of honor. Children sprawled on the floor nearby, listening intently as Lydia's gentle voice brought scripture to life. "And the Lord said to Samuel," she read, her finger tracing the well-worn pages, "Look not on his countenance, or on the height of his stature, for the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." Little Mary Thompson raised her hand. "Is that why you weren't scared when people laughed at you, Mrs. Callahan? Because God sees what's really inside?" Lydia smiled softly. "That's right, dear one. And look how he's brought us all together now, turning mockery into friendship." The afternoon sun slanted through freshly cleaned windows as more neighbors arrived. Women carried covered dishes and preserves to help restock the pantry. Men brought tools and lumber, working alongside Boone to rebuild what had been destroyed. Old Widow Carson sat by the fire, teaching Lydia her secret recipe for sourdough starter. "My grandmother brought this all the way from Virginia," she said proudly. "Time it was shared with someone who'll appreciate it proper." The sound of hoofbeats drew attention to the yard. Pastor Matthews dismounted, removing his hat as he approached the cabin. His shoulders were bent, his expression humble. "Mrs. Callahan," he said softly. "Mr. Callahan, I've come to ask your forgiveness for my earlier doubts. I let prejudice cloud my judgment, when I should have seen the Spirit of Christ in your actions." Lydia stepped forward, taking his weathered hands in hers. "There's nothing to forgive, Pastor. We're all learning to see with new eyes." The pastor's voice cracked. "Would you permit me to dedicate your home in prayer, to ask God's blessing on this place that's become such a testament to His grace?" Boone moved to stand beside his wife, his arm gentle around her waist. "We'd be honored." Word spread quickly. As the sun began to set, families gathered in the cabin's warm light. Children perched on parents' laps, elderly neighbors claimed the chairs near the fire, and young men stood respectfully along the walls. Pastor Matthews raised his hands. "Lord, we gather to dedicate this home as a place of your peace. Where once division ruled, you have built bridges. Where darkness threatened, your light has prevailed." "Amen," voices murmured. Lydia stepped forward, her clear voice lifting in a Cherokee hymn of praise. One by one, other voices joined in, English words weaving with Cherokee until the cabin rang with harmony. The music spilled out into the gathering dusk, carrying across the snow-covered valley. As the last notes faded, Boone found his vision blurring with unexpected tears. He'd spent so many years alone in these mountains, believing that's all life held for him. Now his home overflowed with community, centered on the remarkable woman who'd changed everything. The evening deepened into night. Neighbors departed with warm embraces and promises to return. Soon, only the snap of the fire broke the peaceful quiet. Boone and Lydia sat together by the hearth, the lamplight casting soft shadows. Her father's Bible lay open in her lap, its pages gilded by the flames. "I need to tell you something," Boone said quietly, his rough hand covering hers. "That day you rode into town beside me, folks laughing at my fat bride, I was ready to fight the whole world. But you taught me a better way." He drew a shaky breath. "They laughed at my bride, but you've given me more than I dreamed. More than I deserve." Lydia rested her head on his shoulder, her free hand tracing the Bible's worn leather. "Love isn't about deserving," she whispered. "It's about grace. Look how God has turned their mockery into blessing, their hatred into healing." Through the window, moonlight silvered the silent valley. Snow blanketed the mended fences and rebuilt corral, softening all signs of the recent struggle. But within their cabin, warmth bloomed like a banked fire, steady and sure. Boone drew Lydia closer, marveling at how their bond had only strengthened through trial. The ridicule that once stung had been transformed into testimony. Their home, once a target for hatred, now stood as a beacon of hope. The lamp burned low as they sat together, their hearts full of gratitude. Outside, the winter wind sang through the pines, but here, in this place of answered prayers, peace reigned supreme. Their cabin glowed in the darkness like a lighthouse, guiding others toward the promise that faith, love, and community could overcome any divide. Springtime painted the valley in emerald hues, tender grass pushing through melting snow. Boone and Lydia walked hand in hand across their land, pausing to admire wildflowers dotting the meadow. Where months ago angry torches had circled their homestead, now children's laughter rang out as they played chase through new-grown clover. "Miss Lydia!" little Sarah called, presenting a handful of fresh-picked daisies. "For your table?" Lydia accepted them with a warm smile, watching as neighbors gathered at the long tables they'd set up for Sunday dinner on the grass. The aroma of fresh bread and stewed venison drifted on the breeze. Boone squeezed her hand, his weathered face softened by joy. The scars that life had carved into his heart seemed to heal more each day, soothed by Lydia's gentle presence and infectious laughter. When the church bells rang that afternoon, it wasn't for a wedding, but for a special gathering. The same pews that had once creaked with cruel laughter now held smiling faces as the congregation honored the couple who'd taught them about courage and grace. Lydia's voice lifted in her father's Cherokee hymn, clear and strong. This time, every voice joined in, English and Cherokee words braiding together like a river finding its way home. Tears gleamed in many eyes as the harmonies filled the whitewashed walls. "They laughed at you once," Boone whispered in her ear, "but now they see what I always knew." That evening, they stood together on their cabin porch, watching purple shadows stretch across their hard-won land. Lamplight spilled warmly through the window behind them, a beacon of welcome in the gathering dusk. Boone clasped Lydia's hand, his heart full of gratitude. Their story, built on justice, mercy, and God's grace, was secure at last. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.